And see, like toxic masculinity, the misnomer for insufficient masculinity. As I said earlier, masculinity is a matrix of behavioral protocols imprinted in the mind of a male human so he becomes an effective man, a man of peace and order who can be brave and courageous when necessary.
If a man's art is a reflection of his being, the example for that which comprises his mind, his fears, his passions, or his unique gifts to the world, and this art becomes an art form, a metaform that contains the power to shape and reform the collective the man partakes in, how then can we rightfully divide the man from this art, an art form from society? How can we parse out this seemingly symbiotic ecosystem of art and man, art form and culture? Has the art become the society? Has the man been replaced by the art? Has the medium truly become the message? Has life and society become but an art form reflected, a systematic shuffling of curated images, no longer an authentic existence with direction and meaning, but a spectacle, a free-form social relation among people mediated by images? If so, who is this man? And from which realm have these images and this art bloomed? Art, like any other particular within this world, can be a cure or a curse, a weapon for good, a weapon for evil. Given this, one should always assess the creator, the craftsman, and his message, his foundation of most importance, because his base stabilizes that which he builds. If art form has become the house we now live in, let us be sure its foundation is secure and whole. But what we also discover is that the wickedness of man is great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart is only depraved continually. Is this the same man behind this said art form? This medium conjoined to its spurious message? Should we not be weary of such a possibility? Is there not cause for concern? Has this art form finally presented the alchemic marriage, the non-binary fusion of above and below, the Dionysian bathhouse of baptism? Has Thotiana and Thotimus re-established the pantheon of this world and rejuvenated the loins of its proles? What say you, Thotimus? And what role do you play? What's fascinating about postmodern pop culture today is its unbridled ignorance and naive sense of even its most tacit and obvious representations. Thought culture, for instance, or the consensus on slang terminology, its meanings and taxonomy, and all the patterned behavioral archetypes that follow. They have no real conception of what they believe in, essentially. They have no clear understanding of their own behaviors, wants, and primitive desires. Like feral animals, they frolic and spew. Like wind-up toys or battery-powered trinkets, they click and clack about, sputtering a broken language they create as they go, or learn as they attend to their culture, taken by the whims of emotion and libido. Here the clueless and rabid masses construct a disembodied and brave new world, The interesting aspect of it all is that their cultural behaviors and compulsions are extremely easy to describe through different forms of psycho-spiritual pathology. If they only knew that much of their trends and postures accurately describe verifiable examples of pathological mental illness.
Right. Crazier than crazy.
Documented sets of toxic behaviorism, and types of activity found in demonology. As we witness the inversion of the sexes and merging of the genders, we also discover a pathology within public behavior. As a culturally dominating feature, we can see somatic narcissism restructuring the order and direction of things, foreshadowing things to come, while disintegrating things that once were. THOTIMUS, we will call him, or the postmodern male of today's popular culture, is a great example of the pathological somatic narcissist. At times grandiose, and in others more vulnerable or covert, the somatic type of narcissistic male is all-encompassing and permeates the structure of what we once knew as masculinity. In fact, and to be clear, there is very little masculine about the postmodern male today. Often described as toxic masculinity, alpha male, or chauvinistic, male culture today is not masculine at all. It has become an inversion of masculinity, a distortion of its principles, similar to how femininity has experienced an inverse treatment.
As a butch woman, and dating has been awesome.
For me, it's about being dominant.
Sex toys just totally aren't my jam. As a butch woman, I like to use my hands to fuck off people.
The somatic narcissistic male of today is a pseudo-alpha specimen, coupled with a sensual beta-type nice guy specimen, a weak, emotionally unstable, and insatiable childlike being. Both, and to varying degrees, pursue the life of a false self, consumed by self-deprecation or grandeur, pornographic obsessions, and a reliance on the acceptance of others. The postmodern male of contemporary culture is an impotent lout, a parasitical growth within the bloodstream of our species, threatening its survival. The most troubling aspect of this condition is that it appears to have been procured and rolled out by design, and now promoted through mass distributed media screens, commercial product marketing, network news, and mainstream broadcasting of all configurations. The pseudo-alpha male and the sensual beta-type male have, in exchange for authentic masculinity, become the rubric for a new manly duplicity and postmodern manhood in general. A double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. THOTIMUS reigns as the pantheon phallic god of the pseudo-alpha male variety, the shallow and desperate man-boy of low character and resolve, that thinks between its legs and bears little fruit above the neck. We find most of his attributes fashioned through the sentiments of the hip-hop culture, a modern musical paganistic sex cult that hides its spells and rituals behind hypnotic beat algorithms and further disguises itself in superficial appeals to ethnic pride and a universalist shared identity. But if we were to be honest, we would have to locate its true genesis within the 70s blaxploitation film. Here we find the lowest and most exploitative aspects of inner-city black culture catapulted into mainstream society. Draped over the eyes of viewing audiences, decorating the next generations with the perfect urban regalia to demonstrate they are down and hip, cool, and later, bout it. A long drawn-out succession of depraved, degenerate, and overall counterproductive elements of black culture has eroded sensibility and virtue within the mass sociocultural milieu. And in response, has systematically redefined the behavior of its citizens, and moreover, popularized, monetized, and lionized a new representation of the popular man. A residue that has rubbed off and accumulated itself, growing more and more deranged over time. Though there are many facets within the deconstruction of the natural masculine. For instance, dysregulated socioeconomics, usurpation of naturalism over Christianity, technological progress over moral foundation, quantification over qualification, narcissism over community, state over family. The list is long, and all play their specific roles succinctly. But of most salience to the postmodern eye is the conspicuous projection of mass media pop culture and the deep-seated messages therein. The new popular man of cool, sexually omnipotent and irresistible, detached and cunning, smooth yet hard as granite. The popular man demonstrates all the specific facets of the somatic narcissist. An alpha male minus all of its virtue and character, rendering him a pseudo-version, plastic, tacky, and glib. Detached from a true self in exchange for an image, detached from his own body, such that it becomes an inanimate object that he wields like a sword, not for fun, but for his own imaginary survival, to slay his prey and exhibit his dominance over all that he hates and despises, all that repeatedly remind him of his true impotence. His entitlement turns to murder as a recompense, a reimbursement for things ungiven, fulfilling the massive black hole within him. THOTIMUS is a fiend of the libido, a slave to it. He is an autoerotic sex addict. In lieu of a body to manipulate, his libidinous drive seeks an outlet, anxiety relief. So he turns to pornographic imagery and manual self-gratification. The homosexual act of masturbatory fixation. Postmoderns today endear the act with the term fapping, an act once designated to pubescent boys in hormonal transient stages, has now become culturally ubiquitous, cross-generational, and overall pathological. Amidst a neo-age of weak and deracinated men who today seem to encounter life similar to children, a strain of cultural neoteny sets in, whereby arrested development is normative and behaviors of earlier stages in life are retained, reconstituted, and practiced habitually. This new atomized culture and deracinated men and women create a void within them where substance and meaning is to exist. A state of existential dread ensues. Therefore, they inherently default to the lowest common denominator for direction and satiety. They default to their base level understanding, the flesh, sexual stimulation, sexuality as a philosophy to life, and filter through which one experiences it. This lifestyle, rid of direction, order, and moral foundation, waxes one cold, aloof, naive, and susceptible to the darkest natures of mankind. A good example of the result of this dynamic is the archetype of THOTIMUS, the sometimes pseudo-alpha, other times sensual and soft beta type. THOTIMUS takes on many presentations and expressions, but his lowly spirit of pride, lust, and depravity infiltrates all forms. He resembles the behavior of a vampire, surviving on the lifeblood of others, yet never truly resuscitates his own deadness, merely feeding for the sake of feeding, yet never feeling satisfied. He objectifies himself in the same way he objectifies others. He aims to be the object of desire to his audience. That very audience becomes an object as well. People become interchangeable mirrors, discarded when they give the wrong reflection, and idolized when they reciprocate admiration and perfection. To THOTIMUS, people are sources of narcissistic supply, props on the set of his grandiose feature presentation. He is the writer, director, and lead role, the auteur. All the world is a stage, and the cheers, sneers, and lights breathe in him life. As people become objects, their quantification becomes crucial. The more the merrier, the less the more depressed. Hereby existence becomes a numbers game. Likes, followers, bed notches, and hopscotch dating options. Existence becomes a competition. One-upmanship supplies him points and therefore purpose. He is being seen. His life depends on it. Existence becomes the sole pursuit of being noticed and coveted. The spectacle of the self. A cheater, a liar, a thief in the night that revels in the despair and misfortune of others. Puffed up and godlike, he aims for henosis, a union with divinity. Through theurgy, he achieves a false sense of godhood. Theurgy being his craft, his ritual, the art form. How about some early examples of the THOTIMUS archetype in popular culture? Rather, male proto-thoughts of our generations that have, along with their female counterparts, posed the confluence of gender-specific somatic narcissism in entertainment culture. Further, imposing a new libidinal image of man and woman, allure over substance, sensual influence through seduction, manipulation, and promotion of image replaced that which was once expected and appreciated in the character of man and woman. Several influential and classic alpha-type examples of THOTIMUS would be James Dean, Elvis Presley, Paul Newman, Sesu Hayakawa, Melvin Van Peebles, Shaft and Dolomite, Richard Gere, Burt Reynolds and Tom Selleck, Fabio, and Antonio Banderas. Examples of more beta-type male thoughts would be Rudolph Valentino, Rob Lowe, and Johnny Depp, to name a few. But the male thought of today seems to be much more influenced by the music industry than Hollywood. Though they both play a part, currently young men today seem to demonstrate a postmodern hip-hop induced variety of male degeneracy. With that being said, it would only be right if we look back into some early music cultural influences that have manufactured the contemporary male thought of today. Music and its strategically designed artists have always had its seductive and libidinal influence on its audiences. Performance art in general has demonstrated this component. Vaudeville, for instance, which one could argue single-handedly laid the foundations for the porn industry that would develop decades later. The art form here seems to provide a type of trance-like experience through auditory forms, and mixed with specific messages and images. Certain moods are then created, reactions and behaviors are then produced by way of those moods. Here we find a stimulus-reaction cycle in entertainment music that can be described as libidinal induction through hypnosis. The libido, or sexuality, plays as the linchpin within the process of the entertainment-born stimulus-reaction cycle. This specific cycle is that which has not only been used to popularize entertainers and musical brands through seduction, but resulted in a cultural affect that mirrors the messages and libidinous nature of the entertainment. Simply put, degenerate music has exacerbated degeneracy in culture by reinforcing its affect through repetitive exposure. And not just repetitive exposure alone, but repetitive exposure across demographics through cross-generational indoctrination. A little something for mom and dad, grandpa, grandma, and a little more for the kids. Many movements have utilized this hypnotic cycle for influence culturally, with libidinal influence being the standard mode of attention. Let us point out some high points of indoctrination historically. The modern THOTIMUS of the hip-hop variety has a rich historical development. We will just briefly traverse its line and save much more in-depth treatments for a later installment. Of course, we must always begin the libidinal disturbance in culture with the sexual revolution of the 60s era counter-cult.
You know what I mean? You talk about the hippie. What is the hippie? Where does that name come from, hippie? Why don't you talk about the younger generation, the people who are changing? Why don't you talk about the people who know what's happening and don't agree with the old line of thinking? Why don't you talk about the people who believe in brotherly love and nothing else, and prove it every day on Haight-Ashbury?
Here, the confluence of sexual and value promiscuity, drug abuse, unbridled pursuits of pleasure, and passive leisure uprooted all semblance and order within humanity, kicking off a greater path of deconstruction and derailment of human existence on Earth. Starting with attacking the libido, human direction and human potential was seized rather easily and placed on a track of a single mode. An obsession and preoccupation with sexual stimulation of the loins and drug-induced activity within the brain replaced all of which comprised God's creation. A new aimless direction, a new intangible purpose. The Jezebelian spirit of Thotiana and Ahabian or Dionysian spirit of Thotimus was thoroughly rampant throughout the earth. Soon this counter-cult would transform into Uranian dens of bacchanal, raging druggy and orgy groups, like the factory of Andy Warhol, or the developing disco era, which provided Studio 54, Bacchanalia in White Nose and Numbface. How does all of this relate to the current THOTIMUS of today? Well, where do you think hip-hop got its start? Why, yes, the disco era, and its culture birthed the first representations of the hip-hop movement. Though it is taught that Kool Herc and this one-man band organization spawned the art, it is rarely taught where most of its music was experienced and where most early popular rap acts were allowed to perform. The dark and dreary homosexual dens and bars that reside within and adjacent to the inner city communities. Turbo THOT and blistering somatic narcissist Grace Jones had her start behind the same walls and was part of the same movement. At this time, proto-hip-hop culture and disco funk culture were synonymous, and in many ways, so were their messages. Sexual ambiguity, androgyny, illicit and customary drug use, buttressed by flagrant narcissism, the children of the counterculture, disco, funk, and hip-hop slowly transformed the nature of the popular man, more and more. By the early 80s, we would receive acts like Too Short. We could consider this figure THOTIMUS prime, forming what I term the neo-blaxploitation movement. Too Short reintroduced the spirit of Superfly, the Mac, and Big Willie into the budding inner-city black rap culture, playing on the characters and being influenced by local heroes within his native Oakland and Outer Bay Area. Too Short turned out many young and up-and-coming boys, turning them into quintessential examples of grandiose, woman-hating, woman-using, attention-seeking, somatic narcissists. The postmodern deranged, libidinous male. This movement would dovetail with other areas of entertainment and reconstitute its allure and message. Later we would be exposed to acts like 2 Live Crew, Naughty by Nature, Snoop Dogg, and many, many others that passed on the somatic tradition of THOTIMUS to younger and next generation boys. With a strong emphasis on glorified violence and pride, hyper-narcissism and sexual omnipotence, the popular male has undergone much manipulation and transformation by way of hip-hop culture. It has bled into all facets of popular culture in general, and takes on a symbolic role in all regions of entertainment. Cross-generational and non-discriminatory, hip-hop culture has demonstrated itself to be a mass meme, an egregore of degenerate measure, lurking, feeding, transmuting, and distorting culture from a position of now omnipresence. Hence the debilitation of the modern man to postmodern man, masculine male to feminized man-child, sex-obsessed, drug-addicted, bird-brained proletariat.
Now, before you brush your hair, be sure your comb and brush are clean. Wash them the day you wash your hair. Your teeth? If you brushed them well last night, they're clean now. Brush them again after breakfast, so they'll be clean again until lunch. One more good habit. Before you leave the bathroom, see that it's neat and clean too. Towel and washcloth hung up to dry. Cap back on the shampoo. Bathtub clean. Basin clean. Yes, everything is put away.